Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our new format, Political Economy of Forbes 15. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to have my guest here today. It's John E. Morton. He's a partner of Pollination. It's a climate change advisory and investment firm in Washington, D.C., and John Morton has recently joined this firm. He's also a former White House Senior Director on Energy and Climate under the Barack Obama administration. So welcome, John Morton. I'm very pleased to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Nicholas. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you very much. So I already mentioned that you recently joined the Pollination company. Could you, as a first question, outline your tasks and your duties at this firm?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, Pollination is a global firm. It's about 6 months old, with offices in Australia, Europe, and the U.S. It was founded as I said, about 6 months ago, as a specialist climate change advisory and investment firm. It brings together experts with deep experience in the policy arenas, in the investment arenas, and in the legal arenas. And so if you think about the types of expertise and skill sets that are helping companies and governments manage the transition to a low carbon economy globally, I think it's really those three sets of expertise and backgrounds that are important. Legal, financial, and advisory, and so and policy. So I think we really are unique in that way by bringing together those skill sets. And our goal in life, our mission is to advise companies, corporations, governments on how to expedite their transition to a lower carbon footprint, and to seize the business opportunities that are part of that transition.
I also want to refer to the Climate Finance Partnership, because it brings together the France government, I think the German one, and also BlackRock, to find, so to say, a mixture of capital streams. Is a good example of this blended finance in order to fight climate change or to enhance sustainable solutions. Could you outline, because you helped in the design of this partnership, could you outline the first successes within this framework and the first steps?
Yeah, sure. The Climate Finance Partnership is a good example of what is referred to, in the arena as blended finance. So it's a question of how do you combine public capital and private capital to create a bigger impact. And I think when we think about climate-related investment opportunities or natural capital investment opportunities, not just in renewable energy, but in water, agriculture, food, land use, forestry, sectors like that, there is going to have to be some element of blending in order to provide a level of what we say as de-risking for more commercially minded institutional investors, right? To get them more comfortable with investing into what are still considered frontier markets in some ways. And what the Climate Finance Partnership does, it's just a big example of blended finance. It's, as you mentioned, it's the governments of France and Germany, 4 now large global foundations, so philanthropies, who are combining to put in essentially a layer of de-risking commitment, financial support, that gives BlackRock the confidence that it can go out and raise institutional investor money into a large investment fund to invest into these sectors that I just mentioned in emerging markets. And so it's a great example, I think, of kind of creative partnerships that mobilize institutional investor capital at scale, and the type of thing we're going to need to see a lot more of in the years ahead as we tackle climate change and the investment opportunities underneath it.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about the mobilization of private investment later on, but I want to refer first to a quote because you wrote an article for Reuters, and there you wrote, COVID-19 has tragically revealed the costs and dangers of failing to plan for the inevitable. When we look now in regard to climate change, how do you think has this pandemic so far changed the handling or also like the perception of climate change so far?
It's a good question, and it's the one that my calendar is full of conversations about this topic because it's probably the most important thing I think that can come from this crisis that we're seeing is a recognition and an understanding that in many ways the costs that we are bearing now and the consequences of COVID were in many ways preventable. And I think what we're seeing is countries that were well prepared, that had plans in place, that had resilience built into their healthcare systems and into their economic systems, have suffered far less than countries that were not prepared. And I think the same will be true for climate change, but at a much higher level, many times larger. And I think, for years and years in this country and in throughout Europe, around the world, the WHO had been warning of the coming pandemic. And the question was, what would we do about it? Would we be prepared? And obviously the Obama administration left behind a very clear playbook and a set of preparedness resources that were quite strong. The current administration in the US didn't do much with that. In fact, they kind of cut funding. And I think if you look at climate change, we know climate change is coming. It's not a question of if it is coming. The question is when. And what types of investments are we going to make today to make sure that the impacts of climate change are less severe from an economic perspective. And I'll just say this, that's the kind of cautionary and negative or scary part of climate change. The optimistic part of this is that many of us, Pollination, and governments around the world see climate change as perhaps the single most predictable economic driver of wealth creation and job creation that we've ever had globally. We know it's coming. We see the transition occurring. So the question is, how can we capitalize on that? And how can we take advantage of this inevitable transition to drive economic growth and not have climate change put us on the back foot, but have us invest into the resilience and the economic system and technologies that will help us confront climate change and benefit from it at the same time.
Very interesting. I want to refer to a figure. It was like in a recent article of the BBC, and there was said like the CO2 emissions because of the transport system, because like there are no airplanes, almost no airplanes flying anymore, etc., etc. So because of this drop in the transport system, that the CO2 emissions going to drop between 5 to 8% alone this year. And it's going to be like 2 or 3 billion tons of this warming gas. And they also referred, this article also referred that no war and recession or no pandemic in the century has seen such a dramatic drop in CO2 emissions. Like in the first place, isn't this a good sign, a good first sign or a side effect of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's hard to see. I would be careful about saying, it's a good sign that we have falling emissions because of the pandemic. It's hard to be optimistic and say, bravo world, we've dropped emissions, because of obviously the reason why our economies have essentially shut down. I think it's the more important and the more promising sign is that countries, regions, Europe being a good example, but not only Europe, South Korea is another great example. Australia is another great example, are talking very, very clearly about how to rebuild and emerge from this crisis in a way that is greener and more sustainable. And how do you use these large amounts of public resources in these stimulus plans to not just start the economy up again where it was, but really think about a different way of stimulating economic growth going forward. And so for me, the optimism is not that we've cut emissions because of an economic crisis that has ground our economies to almost a halt, but rather the conversations and the decisions that are being made now in European capitals, in Brussels, in South Korea, in Australia, and other places about a more resilient, greener, more sustainable recovery. And that's where I take some optimism about what we're seeing here.
That's a good point, because like in our BBC article, it was also referred to the financial crisis in 2008 in Europe. And they also wrote like the fossil fuels, like the demand for fossil fuels in order to produce electricity has dropped after the financial crisis, and it has never gained the levels in comparison to before. And also like solar and wind power energy sources were increasingly used. How do you see, I mean, we cannot foresee, of course, the end of the pandemic, but do you see also because of these talks going on in the countries you were mentioning before, do you see maybe also like a comparable development that the fossil fuels going to be permanently reduced and the renewables going to rise again?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, a couple things there. I think what's interesting is if you look at last year, renewables were almost 75% of new globally installed capacity, electricity capacity added globally. That's pretty astonishing. So prior to the pandemic, we were already at a case where almost 3/4 of new electricity generation capacity added globally was renewables. I think very few people understand just how big a part of today's electricity mix renewables are. So that was the first thing. The second thing is renewables has proved to be incredibly resilient during this crisis. If you look at the percentage of electricity that's being generated from renewables now, as a percentage of total, it's even higher than it was before. Why? Because the sun keeps blowing, the sun keeps shining, the wind keeps blowing, and it's cheaper once it is installed. So I think you've seen a level of resilience to that renewables had that is unlike what fossil fuels can offer. And the supply chain disruptions that have affected both renewables and fossils, I think once again show that fossil fuels are just far less secure because of the geopolitical elements, because of very long transmission, complex transmission and distribution channels, et cetera. So yes, I don't think that we're going to go back to, I think we will continue to see a movement away from fossil fuels in our electricity mix. And I think COVID is one reason why that is the case.
Mm. Let's go back, so to say, to the mobilization of private investment, what we talked, you were mentioning before, because it's crucial for you, because you're saying public investment, it's not enough, so to say, to tackle climate change. There has to be enough private investment. What do you see are still the biggest challenges in the mobilization of private capital, private investment in the United States, but also in Europe?
Look, I think private capital, institutional money is very, very conservative. It moves. It follows as we see time and time again in following the stock market. It moves in a herd mentality, right? And no one likes to be first. Very few people like to be second. Not many people like to be third. Everyone likes to be 10th or 15th or 20th, right? And they want to be safe. And so far, the capital markets have been relatively slow to adjust to what we see as a very clear new reality, which is a movement toward a lower carbon economy. The good news is that that's changing relatively quickly, and that when herds move, they move quickly at a fast rate, not on a linear line, but at an inflection point. And so I would imagine in the next 2 to 3 years, irrespective of who wins the next presidential election in this in the US, we're going to see a fundamentally different set of considerations that go into how institutional money is allocated. We're already seeing some of the biggest asset managers in the world make very strong commitments about what they want to do on climate and how they perceive carbon to be a liability that needs to be, if not priced, at least disclosed. And I think what you're going to see is as the carbon footprint of portfolios is increasingly disclosed to investors, there's going to be a huge recognition about the liabilities underneath underneath carbon. And so the first step is disclosure. And I think we're getting close to seeing that herd tipping point where financial institutions are going to begin disclosing. And then once you start disclosing, investors are going to say, well, wait a minute, that's a liability. What are you going to do about that? They're going to start shifting their money relatively quickly. And again, I don't think these things occur on a linear line. I think they occur quite quickly. And we're months, if not a short number of years away from markets adjusting, I think, relatively abruptly to carbon and climate risk.
In regard to emerging markets, you said like in an interview a few years ago that like one of the hurdles, one of the challenges to mobilize private investment are still the regulatory frameworks. Is this still true? Or do you see any major changes like in this regard?
Sure. Yeah, and I think what I was saying is we clearly have regulatory uncertainty today as it relates to climate and carbon and climate change around the world, not just in the United States. However, I think where there is certainty among people who follow markets, not just climate markets, but financial markets more generally, is the fact that we are moving in one direction. The direction of travel as it relates to climate change is clear. Countries around the world, 190 of them, have signed the Paris Agreement. Corporations are making large and significant commitments to decarbonizing. Financial institutions are increasingly allocating their portfolios and making commitments about how they're going to take climate and carbon into consideration. And so if you were to have 100 analysts or investors sitting around the table and say, hey, do you think in 5 years the policies and regulations around climate and carbon are going to be tighter and more strict or weaker and more dispersed? 99% of them will say stronger and tighter. And so people understand the direction of travel here. And as an investor and as a company, looking forward about where your markets are going to be and what consumer demands are going to be and what regulations are going to be, you need to be betting on the future, not the past or the present. And so that's where, again, I take some, I'm discouraged that regulations aren't more advanced and more harmonized, certainly in the US, but I'm optimistic about the direction of travel that we're heading in.
As a last question, I want to talk about the United States because it has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, and also when we compare it like on a global level, China, for example, is nowadays like the biggest manufacturer and exporter of solar, photovoltaic, and wind and battery technologies. Where are the United States going to, or what's the status quo you think in terms of climate change and energy markets?
Look, so the U.S. hasn't yet left the Paris Agreement. It has announced its intention to do so. And as you probably know, and as some of your viewers may know, the earliest that can happen actually is the day after the November presidential election that we're going to be having this year. So there's a certain irony here that that we won't be able to leave Paris until the day after the election. And obviously, depending upon who wins, there's no way we're leaving if Biden wins the election. That's the first thing. Second thing you pointed out, I think really, really important. If you look at China today, they are the largest both manufacturer, exporter, and user of solar, wind, battery technology, et cetera. They started investing in those technologies as a function of their stimulus plan due to during the 2008-2009 recession that we had 12 years ago. those were smart investments, right? China saw the future and invested in it. And today they dominate the technologies that provide 3/4 of new energy, new electricity installed capacity every year. So you have to think about, what are those technologies going to be of the next 10 years? How can we be smart about using our scarce public resources in investing in those things that are going to grow? And we take the view at Pollination that those technologies are going to be in natural capital, natural resources, water, food, forestry, agriculture, etc., in addition to energy storage and the underlying energy technologies that power the world. And so we see a lot of innovation in the US, a lot coming out of the States, just without a very strong federal leadership at the moment. And that's my fear at the moment, is that we don't have sufficient federal leadership to kind of really push that agenda in the years ahead.
John Morton, thank you very much for your interesting insights, also from the United States, and all the best to Washington, DC.
Thank you. Pleasure being with you.
And to our viewers, thank you very much again for watching us. You can also subscribe our channel. It's below at the YouTube channel. And also join us for Victoria Frister. She will be, and my colleague Chloe, and she is founder of the Fleur de Paris. So join us later at 4 o'clock. See you soon.